Buonasera, benvenuti per questo evento, un altro nell'arco della nostra lunga, bellissima collaborazione con Silvia Misiti e la fondazione gestita da lei, la Foundation for Scientific Research di IBSA. Per noi è sempre un'occasione particolare perché queste collaborazioni ci aprono ovviamente delle possibilità nuove che vanno anche oltre la programmazione delle mostre. Grazie a Silvia Misiti, grazie alla IBSA Foundation, siamo in grado anche di offrire a voi dei temi, delle persone qui presenti a Lugano, come questa sera, che è una serata un po' particolare perché parleremo di un tema che forse non è poi così conosciuto da tanti voi, soprattutto non nell'ambito dell'arte, del mondo dell'arte, perché parleremo dei videogames, dei giochi video, perché ci sono da una parte tanti artisti come il nostro ospite questa sera che verrà introdotto proprio adesso, Jakob Kudsk Steensen, e anche la professoressa da Zurigo, la Maike Thies, che farà l'intervista, che farà la conversazione, e loro entrambi sono specialisti in questo mondo che si è sviluppato negli ultimi 15-20 anni, dove tanti artisti hanno capito che tutto il know-how, tutte le competenze che si sono sviluppate intorno a questo mondo del videogaming ovviamente offrono anche delle possibilità, delle vie all'arte, agli artisti. E questo, come potete immaginare, è un capitolo affascinante, nuovo, giovane dell'arte contemporanea, e il nostro artista Jakob veramente molto ben posizionato di raccontarci questa sera come mai, da dove nasce questo interesse nei giochi video, dove sono i punti comuni, dove magari sono le differenze di quando ritroviamo artisti lavorando con queste tecniche e quando abbiamo dei professionisti dell'ambito gioco. E il gioco ovviamente, come sappiamo, sempre dall'inizio all'arte. Quindi grazie a Silvia, grazie a tutte le mie colleghe che ci hanno aiutato questa sera. Iniziamo ovviamente con Valentina Bernasconi dell'AC, che è sempre importantissima, Céline Muschietti ha organizzato da parte nostra, insieme con tutte le colleghe della comunicazione, Sara Greenwood con Martina Santurli, Laura Pomari e tutto il team della nostra comunicazione. Dall'ambito curatoriale il progetto, la collaborazione con IBSA è seguita da Francesca Benini, grazie anche a Francesca, assistita da Thais Grandi Venturi, anche loro hanno collaborato per preparare questa serata. E adesso passo un attimo a Silvia, grazie.
Grazie direttore. Anche da parte mia benvenuti, mi dispiace per il tempo inclemente, ma forse dopo la conversazione di stasera magari avremo anche un'idea leggermente diversa su questo, perché poi il nostro artista di stasera comunque si è occupato e si occupa anche di, oltre a appunto di gaming, anche di clima e problematiche relative al clima. Come il direttore ha detto, è una bellissima collaborazione quella tra la Fondazione IBSA e il MASI, cominciata nel 2017. Abbiamo deciso insieme di esplorare questa area sempre più affascinante, che è quella dell'arte e scienza, di come questi due mondi si contaminano l'uno con l'altro. Abbiamo cominciato con delle conversazioni, più che altro dei dialoghi, e piano piano ci stiamo sempre più specializzando nel portare qui a Lugano degli artisti che sono proprio immersi in questa, vengono ispirati dalla scienza e per la loro arte. Quest'anno abbiamo deciso, insieme al direttore, al MASI, insieme a Francesca Benini, appunto curatrice da parte del MASI del progetto, di dedicare la parte scientifica alla tecnologia digitale. Quindi l'artista di stasera è immerso in questa tecnologia, così come anche il 20 novembre avremo Ed Atkins, che è anche lui specializzato in questa. Ovviamente i temi che trattano i due artisti sono diversi, stasera l'abbiamo sentito, mentre quello del 20 novembre è un po' più intimo, un po' più legato all'aspetto umano, in contrasto con questa tecnologia e innovazione. Anche da parte mia vorrei ringraziare tutto il team del MASI, senza che ripeto tutti i nomi, mentre ci tengo a ricordare i miei colleghi, Sara Comodo che è lì, Jacopo Crespi che è lì e gli altri colleghi della Fondazione IBSA che vengono sempre molto affezionati alle nostre attività, e anche a qualche collega dell'azienda che vedo nel pubblico, e a tutti voi. A questo punto io chiamo Maike, che introdurrà lei Jacob e modererà tutta la serata. Al termine, non andate via, facciamo un brindisi tutti insieme nella stanza qui accanto. Buona serata.
Good evening, everybody. It's such a great pleasure being here tonight with all of you. And yeah, it's a great pleasure having the opportunity to talk tonight to the internationally acclaimed artist Jakob Kudsk Steensen, who is working in the intersection of ecology, arts, science, and technology. I would like to suggest to have a look on a brief video snippets of one of his latest project, which is called Ephemeral Lake, a project that is currently on show at Kunsthalle Hamburg. It is one of your most recent works, Jakob, and it marks sort of a shift of focus from vanishing ecosystems to those that temporarily appear and reappear. Can you, maybe before we have a look at the video, some background info, how this project started and what kind of framework it's being shown?
Yes, so it's very nice to be here. Yeah, I'm Jakob, an artist. I live in Berlin, from Denmark. And the artwork that we're going to see some video from, it's also going to show some of that work. But I spent 2 months in the Mojave Desert in California, where every 5 years there's a lake that appears for a few months. So, and that phenomenon is called an ephemeral lake. So a whole ecosystem, you see some of it on the picture here, and I'll explain some of this in the video, will appear for just a few months. So there will be insects, water, and different life forms. And then it vanishes again. And the biggest lake that has ever been recorded in this is a big canyon in the Mojave Desert. It's the deepest point in North America, so it's negative 70 meters, and it's also the driest and warmest place. And in this place that's normally one of the most dry, warm places in the world, there was a whole lake all of 2023. And now it's gone. So it's the biggest lake that was ever documented in the Mojave Desert in California, appeared 2023. So I went there, I stayed there, I explored this place, I record sounds, I digitize things, I talk to biologists, scientists, and then slowly I built like a whole world from this that has, it's a video game simulation, it's a musical piece, but there's also 3D printed glass objects. So I also start to go into nature, work with technology, build these virtual landscapes, and now I also start to kind of morph them into new things. And the most difficult thing to communicate for a space like this, like here, or images, is that my work is very musical. So they're also like living musical instruments that play sound and music around you, with like speakers in the whole room. But we can dig into all this. Because I'm kind of an infinite speaker, so I have to stop myself or use stuff, or I just roll.
So then I suggest that we just jump into the video snippet. It's a rather short one, and then we start speaking again to all of you.
Yeah.
many of our ecosystems are undergoing tremendous changes due to climate change and biodiversity loss. Even though your digital worlds and artistic practices seem like an invitation to mediate and immerse in beauty, you are also, and this may seem contradictory, explorating and showing the fragility and vulnerability of our natural environments. Jakob, what can your digital art and immersive installations contribute to the overall discourse on climate emergency?
That's a very big question, but I think I can give some context to my work. Like what we're seeing here is a artwork called Reanimated from 2018, and I showed it in the Venice Biennale in 2019. And it's kind of an example of my approach. So for the past 7 years, I've been working in natural environments and working a lot with natural historians. So people who know about species, environments, and natural phenomena that used to exist in our world, but now they're gone. And this artwork called Reanimated, it's sound, video, and virtual reality artwork. And it's based on interviews I did with an ornithologist, Douglas Pratt. And he spent 40 years of his life studying different bird species on the Kaua'i Plateau outside Hawaii. So it's like a mountain plateau on a small volcanic island. And many of the species he studied his whole life, they all went extinct in the 90s. So very recently, they all vanished. So it's like I interviewed him on his memories of these species, and he told me a very emotional story that he makes drawings of them. And when he draws these birds, it's his way of bringing them back, but as like a transformed memory. So it was more like the emotion, it was more like a psychological process. Mm-hmm. So on my artwork, they deal in many different ways. Like the lake is kind of a new way of doing this that we were talking about before in the desert, but they always deal with an actual memory of someone who's seen a place or a species that doesn't exist anymore, or archives, recordings of them. So I worked a lot with loss of natural environments, but also transformation of them, and then how do we perceive them now as memories? Because Douglas, he also had sound recordings of this bird that's extinct. And he sent me a sound file of the bird's mating call. So the last time it was recorded was a bird kind of trying to sing for another bird that probably didn't exist. And this is like a very emotional thing, and then I start thinking that there's a sense of like ghost media or archives, sort of, that we can access. Now we really live in a time where through virtual worlds, through sound, through pictures, memories, we can kind of dive into places that are vanishing. So I think like with my work, I take more like a psychological or emotional approach. I play with these memories, these psychologies, or I think about shifting scales, like kind of a human body in an environment, or what does it mean, kind of the perspective from an insect or a bird or something. I kind of shift different perspectives and through the psychology. But it's really kind of the psychology of changing climates that interests me and how they change us. So when the outer world changes, they also changes us sort of in our minds and the way we feel. So that's my axis, or like that's where I found a more like a niche that I think makes sense as an artist. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Please allow me to jump back briefly to the ephemeral lake, because this was in the context at Kunsthalle Hamburg, also due to the fact that there was the 250th anniversary of Caspar David Friedrich. And in fact, parallels could be drawn between your artistic practice and the works of Caspar David Friedrich. One could perceive your work to be rooted in a deep fascination with complex ecosystems and an intent to make landscape accessible in a multisensorial way. And I was wondering, what is your fascination with Caspar David Friedrich?
Yeah, so this project, so this is looping many different artworks, so you have an idea of my work, because I made many works for more than 10 years of these virtual worlds and landscapes. So it's kind of too much to dive into all of it. But the lake project that we saw in the beginning, it's at the Hamburger Kunsthalle. for the next 6 months on 2 floors of the building. It's like a virtual world, a musical piece, and these glass sculptures, and we'll see some of this later. But I was invited to create an artwork for that museum for the 250th birthday of Caspar Friedrich, and the main reason they invited me is that when he was making paintings of like icebergs or different environments, he actually went out. For example, he has this painting called Das Eismeer, with this ship very dramatically coming through the ice, and there's these big kind of pinnacles. But he's never been to any Arctic region. He first made drawings of little floating pieces of ice on the rivers in Germany, and then he, like a collage, he put these different drawings together to make his paintings. And this approach is very similar to what I do. I go to these environments and I get little pieces of sound and objects that I 3D scan and photograph, and then I build these whole environments from them. So this was the main reason that the Kunsthalle invited me to show in Hamburg for his birthday, to do this kind of solo exhibition there. But another thing is also the transformation of perspective from having like a painting or with like a figure inside of it. So in my work, there's never a figure. It's more like the environment immerses your body with like sound and images around you. So you feel it, like literally sometimes there's a bass or a sound and it's designed, you cannot hear it, but you can physically feel it. So sometimes the vibration of one of my works might enter your body. At the same time, you have the image that we're seeing now, but it also kind of enters you. Where with Caspar David Friedrich, there was, or the 1800 or the more traditional painting, there's a landscape, there's a picture, a horizon that you look into, and typically you see like a figure with a back to you, what they call like the Rückenfigur in German, and it looks into the environment. But when I see those paintings, what I mainly think about is kind of the studio or the city right behind that person, making this imagination of this place. Because Caspar David Friedrich, he didn't really go to many of these places. He made little drawings in different places and put them together in the studio. So I'm very interested in kind of moving beyond this more traditional perspective of contradicting a figure and an environment and like collapsing these and merging them together in these spatial experiences. These are artworks that kind of surround your mind and your body. So I try to like, break down a barrier of the person and the landscape and the medium. I try to kind of, or play with that form, or bring it into question.
And when you start a project, you spend a significant time doing field research. So maybe you can give us some insight into this very particular process of yours. What are the steps you take? How do you prepare for this kind of these field trips, and how do you work with your findings?
Yeah, so typically when I make an artwork, it takes 1 year, and I make more or less one artwork every year. And then that shows in different formats. It might show as an exhibition, it might go literally to like video game festivals, or I start to also transform my artwork so people can download them and buy them as short video games. So the main artwork for me, and this is what takes a whole year, is going to these environments and doing the field work. But the artwork itself, the way I look at it, is this virtual landscape that can exist even when you're close to your eyes, when there's no artwork. That's kind of a simulation. This is the lake in Hamburg. These are some pictures of this exhibition that opened last month. That's some of the installation to the left and some more pictures of the work. So it's kind of like I go to the environment, but before I go there, I research a place from more like a cognitive level. So I look at, literally to make this work, I was looking at the Mojave Valley, which is this big desert valley in California, and I look at it from the eyes of a satellite. I look at like data from NASA, I look at like studies that geologists use to kind of read and understand the landscape more from a top-down perspective. So Caspar David Friedrich was looking like this, but now we start to look like upside down into our world. Like when we go outside, we use a map on the phone. That is literally you, a satellite, kind of like tracking you on the ground, and you're looking at yourself kind of from above. But it's a very kind of authoritarian view. It's kind of like there, looking down. So I start projects by looking at a place like this before I go there with my own body. And then I plan a route, and I start to talk to researchers, like I talk to park rangers. So these are the kind of managers of this desert, that take the caretakers of it, that know the species, the environmental conditions. I do like interviews over the phone, over email. I compile a lot of research. But this is more like research of language. It is sort of research of academia. It is more like a technocratic way of understanding the place. Mm-hmm. But it gives me an entry point. Why am I there? Okay, there are ephemeral lakes. They appear and they disappear. I want to go and study this phenomena. So that's like the starting point. But then when I arrive, I go to the places, I start recording sounds of different species, environments, I start taking photos and things. And then after a few weeks, this kind of cognitive level from the research, it breaks down. And suddenly you start feeling or sensing or seeing things that you didn't see before. And this is what's really, this is where the shift is, where I start making material for the artwork. Because I'm more interested in finding rocks and pieces and species that look kind of unique or different. So we haven't seen them before. So you kind of I look for things, a perspective on this place that the scientists wouldn't tell you about first, that you cannot kind of search for Google Images. Mm-hmm. I look for these really strange objects. And it's a combination of myself spending a few weeks there, and suddenly you start to sort of, literally you walk different. Because most places, people that live in a city, they always walk and look at the world in the way a room is designed. We look at the door because we go to the door, we look to the seat, we look up to the stage, you sit down, there's always a direction like this. But when you find these strange formations, you start to look like up, down, round. You might turn around yourself 3 times in the same place in order to kind of encounter something that you didn't know existed. And this is the trick that I then start to focus on in the artwork, that I really record and everything. And it's the same when I work with biologists that study these formations and places. It's like in the beginning when I meet a scientist, they ask me, what do you want to know? Mm-hmm. And I can't say, tell me something I don't know. Because they're like, I know everything about this place. There's 1 million species. Tell me exactly what you want to know. And then I from my own research, I have some ideas. They show me some places. And then over time, when they become a little more friendly, you meet them a few times, then they're like, oh, by the way, I really like this flower. It's not related to your research, but I really like this flower. And then I say, like, tell me about that flower. And then in that flower, there might be like a beetle or something. And that beetle is really interesting. And that ends up entering the world of the artwork. But this is a strange journey to find this material. So this takes a really long time. It's like I'm 2 months in the desert. It takes 1 year to make the artwork. So it's like 2 months in the desert, then like 3 months in the studio. And then at some point, I start bringing in other artists. So then I invite like writers, musicians. In this case, I invited a very known experimental cellist called Oh Kyung Lee from Seoul. And she has made these like vibrations on the cello to the artwork and made like a series of individual notes, almost like subatomic sound recordings, that the artwork is like now it gets really technical, so we can dive into this. But it's
go ahead.
Yeah, it's like there's a point in the artwork when I build out the world that I invite other artists into that world, and then they start responding to it. But I don't really tell them what to do. So with Oh Kyung Lee, it's sort of I show her images, and then I tell her it's a scientific fact that these mountains are created by a scientific process in the desert called orogeny. So orogeny is the study of vibrations from the continental plates that creates mountains. There's an actual vibration sound you can record. And I tell her, this creates life in this place. These are the images and the work. What can you do with this? And then she starts sending a collection of sounds back, and then I give some feedback, and then that's kind of a process. But the artwork itself mixes these sounds together on its own, because it's like it's a virtual simulation, so it can mix sound and things together with no one controlling it. So she doesn't know what it will sound like, and I doesn't really know what it will look and sound like in the end too. It's the kind of this world that starts being put together, and then it has all sorts of code and technology that mixes it kind of around you in space. Wow. Yeah, so this is, yeah. But in the end, it's very simple as an audience. There's screens, there's sound. but it has this kind of strange poetry to it and kind of surprises in visuals that even surprise myself, you know. So that's where I feel like the artwork starts to be really interesting or finished. When it starts to become something I couldn't imagine before, and when my own work and some other artist work start to connect and become like a new entity. And this is kind of fun.
This sounds very easy now when we follow your talk, but I guess also, like from my perspective, having worked in interdisciplinary collabs, there are also some challenges, because at the end you need to bring something together that also fits your vision, so to say, even though you're probably shifting the vision slightly due to this collaborative process. Would you like to elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, so, okay, I mean, fundamentally when you do these type of collaborations, if it's an artwork or if you make video games or just all sorts of new combinations of fields, there are always moments where what you had in mind, you have to let go of because something new appears. But that's what you're looking for. So it's almost more like, instead of saying, this is what I want to make, this is what it will be shown, help me make it, and now I will make it. It's more like, how can I design a process that allows for different new explorations to happen within that process. Mm-hmm. So instead of like designing an artwork from the beginning, I design a process. So I set up, I mean, for the lake, for example, it's like, I have my research period, then I have my own immersion in the environment, and there's literally like, there's budgets, there's timelines for all of this. And when I'm there, I have to let go of my research on location. I have to completely let go after a few weeks in order to get this material. And then when I come back in the studio, there's a video game developer I also collaborate with called Water Rainance in Belgium. And then I start telling him of some of the experiences I have, or how a temporary lake works. So there's water that appears, that goes up and down. There are these shapes that come through the ground from different pressures. And then I start working with him on like, okay, how can we code this virtual environment so it starts doing some of these scientific phenomena. Mm-hmm. And then he starts coding that. And then things come back, and then some things are interesting, some other things are not interesting. And then there's kind of points where something really strange and imaginative happen, like, okay, there'll be some images here, I don't know which ones.
This bell.
Yeah, this bell, but it's like a tree that turns into a snake, for example, is another artwork. But it turns into a snake because someone told me, a language researcher, that people used to make songs for some rivers, and in the songs they were singing that the trees turn into snakes. But then there's a programmer that I work with, and I'm like, these trees that I've 3D scanned and put into the work, we have to turn them into snakes. And then he goes, turn them into snakes. What kind of snake? What kind of movement? What are you dealing with? Because the technology will put limitations to everything you're doing. So you have to kind of translate the process of a concept about the natural world that someone is telling you is real. Like beneath the desert lake, for example, there's a water reservoir in the desert. So it's the driest desert in the world, but beneath the ground, there's actually an underground river. And the park rangers told me, in California, we know there's a river, but we cannot see it. It's so far down, we cannot send anything down there, but there's a river. And then I'm like, okay. So then I start imagining what this river looks like. And then I start from my imagination to 3D reconstruct this underground river as part of that artwork. And then Oh Kyung Lee starts making this like, whoa, these images are really crazy, this is really interesting. And then she starts making some new sounds for those underground, and then I kind of change the artwork around. And then I start taking some of these 3D worlds and I start 3D printing glass. And then I start connecting her sound to the glass. So the glass like makes these vibrations like, and that comes from her cello. So it's like it's a very living process. And I think the artwork becomes so much stronger when you dive into that life. Mm-hmm. If you are too constricted and having too tight an idea of what you want exactly before you start, you're going to get exactly what you want, but you'll miss out on all the new stuff, all the unexplored terrains. Because if you can fully explain and draw out what you want to make with like digital technologies, I don't really see the point in a way, because I would be able to just explain, even with words, what it's going to be. Where I think it's really interesting when things kind of transform and change and kind of go back and forth. Yeah, so it's a very living process. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful that it works out for you this way. Maybe I think in the introduction there was already a hint that you have been working for quite a while in the AAA game industry and the blockbuster industry. That is the industry brand of video games that has budgets such as Hollywood movies, so to say. And I was wondering, I mean, working in this field, it seems to me super interesting, but also, of course, very time-consuming and very specialized. Was there a key moment in your career when you decided to leave this kind of work sphere and really to shift your practice, your skill set?
Yeah, it was about 8 years ago. So when you work on like larger productions for virtual creation. I mean, some video games today, there's like 200 people working for 4 years. They're massive, complex productions. But my job was to I was a producer, so there would be someone who had an idea, a story. And then I received like some pages, literally a PDF, like 4 pages. And it tells you what you're going to make, you know, and then you're like, okay. So now I have to make this, and then I call my friends, and it's like, hey, do you want to make the sound? Do you want to make the 3D objects? Do you want to make the trees? And do you want to animate a monkey? Like, this is kind of like a fun process. Like, that part of it is really fun. But I always felt like it was kind of weird that you always had this kind of line of how it's going to be built out. You know,
it's very rigid, yeah.
Very rigid, yeah, because you're dealing with big productions and things like this, that's budget and everything. So it's very rigid. And as an artist, I wanted to reverse that method completely. So it's like, okay, that's kind of a world and a landscape I want to make. And then I created more like unilateral. So there's, like I was saying before, there's like the musician and programmer and me, and there's kind of stuff going back and forth like this. And with exhibitions, you have a lot of freedom, because you can kind of just make whatever you want in a sense. Where when you make a game, it has to work on hundreds of thousands or a million devices, and it has to sell, and it has to tick all these boxes, you know. So you're constantly have all these barriers you need to kind of encounter. Where like with the lake, like I can create these strange shapes in the work, and just because it's interesting and it feels good, it feels like it resonates with the concept of the scientific story of a place. So for me, it was mainly wanting to work in a very different manner and not knowing what the final thing becomes, and using more like video games are amazing because they're extremely collaborative. You know, there's an author, there's a performer, like there would be like a narrator, that's someone like doing motion capture, like a body actor. You know, there'll be sometimes there's like consultants. Video games might work with historians. They explain like what happened in a place, how it works, and then there's like artists who starts to make like the virtual costumes for characters, and someone is starting to write. There's all these different people that has to work together, because what's fascinating with these technologies is that one thing can break them all. So it's code in the end, and if a line in the code breaks, the whole thing will shut down. So you have many different people, but in the end, it has to come together in a kind of rhythm in a way. I mean, the code literally has to work. Where in a lot of other disciplines, you know, you can have them not really working together, but you could still show costumes and have someone play music and show a video in here. But in a game, they literally have to interconnect in a completely literal manner. Otherwise, it will not work. So this is kind of fascinating, because you need to make compromises, but you can also start doing these strange links. So there's something I try to do in my artworks, like these glass lamps here, for example. They're this big, and they're 3D printed formations in the desert that used to be underwater 200,000 years ago. There's these rocks made of like little fish bones, and I 3D scan those, and then enlarge them and 3D print them into glass. Inside the glass there's a lamp, and that lamp creates to these cello strings by the musician. Those strings are controlled by the virtual landscape. So as this virtual landscape is changing time of day and things are happening, these glass lamps and the cello strings also change. So you could do some really interesting combinations across different disciplines. Something might move in a virtual world, like an insect here, and then there's sound that moves around physically. There's kind of all sorts of spatial thinking. That can get like really, really nerdy and technical. But it's fun because then you have to have a conversation with someone on what that implies. How is that going to change suddenly this cello's work? She has to also be okay with her work being very different than what she originally heard and recorded. So you have to work with people who are also interested in, they have to know their speciality, but they also have to be open to understanding that it might connect to something else in the virtual world, and they kind of start impacting each other. So you have to be okay with letting go of some of your own control, yet at the same time you have that one code that must exist, otherwise it breaks. So at the same time, as an artist, I also must kind of create conditions for each collaborator to feel welcome within, so it doesn't become completely random either. I still have to direct it somehow, but it's more like getting to know the other artists, the perspectives, and kind of weave it together, which is a very difficult thing to explain, I think. But it's more like, I mean, it makes it very, it's a little bit opposite what people might think when they think of like virtual things, or it's so nerdy on a computer, or it's very solitary, but the creation process is extremely collaborative, and it's very dynamic and very open. So it's fun. It's really fun to make. It's very rewarding. Where if you're just making drawings, it can be really lonely, you know, but this is kind of fun.
Yeah, and everything is so interconnected. You mentioned it already, like that video games are such an interdisciplinary medium.
Yeah.
So, of course, there is not only one right inspiration. You can find inspiration in movies, you can find inspiration in music, but also in literature. So, no, I'm wondering, as I know that you're very much into sci-fi literature and also like sci-fi films, for example, what kind of inspirations you take and how do you alter these kinds of inspiration that they fit into your art pieces?
Yeah, I think the magic that I kind of learned from games is this. It's actually to create at least the type of games I liked growing up. That would be musicians, writers, authors, animators, a lot of really interesting people. And the way the references came together has always felt kind of fresh to me. You know, so like, as an artist, I'm more interested in following like games and literature than film. Film to me is sort of less interesting. It feels more established, or the types of story or something, where there are two things I like with games and literature. One is the long format, you know, so like streaming, for example, has kind of broken down the idea of long format complex films. They're very short snippets now. But in literature still, games might actually soon change also and become a lot like that with streaming, but this is a whole other type of conversation. Yes. But it's a long format. So, you know, a book might take you 15 hours to read, and if it's really powerful, it can really change your perspective on something. So for me, it's like, as I'm going to an environment, I start reading, there's like the science, there's me there, and then I start reading science fiction, but more for sensory descriptions. So I'm trying to think who I was reading for this desert. I mean, I remember I was recently reading a book by Ballard called The Crystal World. So it's the story of a forest that turned into crystals. And this landscape is also crystallizing. It's like these objects in the desert, it's kind of crystals coming out of the ground. So okay, I was like, I'm learning the science of why these crystals come out of the ground. I'm there with my own body. And then I start reading this science fiction by Ballard of this future where there's this jungle that kind of strangely all the leaves and plants turn into crystals. As they turn into crystals, there's the lead character's wife starts kind of becoming this crystal world. And she gives into it. And the main character, does not. So he ends up like fleeing this new world. So one person gave into this new natural environment, and kind of like become that world. And the other one tries to defend themselves towards this new reality, and they leave it. So for this work, it's like I'm reading this, and then I start thinking, because the Kunsthalle in Hamburg is there's this dome. It's a perfect sphere. It has pretty insane echo. Then I start thinking, okay, I want this environment to feel like sometimes you understand what's going on. It's a natural environment. And sometimes I want it to feel like it's entering your mind. And it's kind of it's playing tricks on you. Mm-hmm. Maybe slightly uncomfortable, but kind of alluring. So either you kind of like stay in that or you leave. So there's kind of a push-pull of feeling like you understand that world you're looking at, and another one where it's changing something in your mind. But that idea came from reading that book. So I just surround myself with different inspirations when I make artwork. So I'm literally sitting in the desert and I'm trying to look for an interesting description of a plant that turns to crystals. And then I underline it, and it's like, oh, it's these blue fragmentations. And then I go in the computer and I'm like, oh, I have to make some of these blue fragmentations. But it's just like a strange combination of interests that kind of merge together. I can go on and on about that, but I think one thing that's really interesting with games themselves is that a lot of the newest, big kind of blockbuster, even TV shows, are based on video game stories. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons one is called Fallout, but the guy who wrote that's like almost 30 years ago, and I played this when I was 12 years old, and there was also a desert in California, and I was like, whoa, this is really wild. No one in my school talks like this. No one. So I kind of explored this video game called Fallout when I was 12 years old. And there's this whole strange sci-fi future world happening. And now that's become like the most seen TV show this year. So that is because the references. This is my own philosophy of why this is happening, that now Hollywood and big productions are starting to license stories from games because the games are more kind of adaptive to understanding what the kind of fractured reality. They are these strange collaborative worlds, and we live in these strange fractured realities now with devices and everything happening. It's like you can open up your phone and you can like look into a forest at the other side of the planet. You couldn't do that 20 years ago. This is pretty insane. It's like that we have all these connected worlds. But video games have kind of inherently embraced that for 30 years already. And it's reflected in the stories, in the worlds, this kind of fragmentation, and how does that change your politics and the world culture? So I think that's why now there's, like I read the study, that there's 70 new films and movies coming out over the next few years, and they're all just licensed from the writers of past video games, because there's something there that's kind of. But for me, it's this strange. Yeah. Okay. Combination of references. That's. Yeah,
I can totally follow.
Yeah.
And I would be interested in learning more about this. But I think we have to move on a bit slightly. And I mean, it's obvious we strive this in our conversation, that you have a very specific way of designing your exhibitions. One could think you are in the studio designing these digital worlds, developing this real-time animation experience, but there you don't stop. You are invited by different kind of internationally acclaimed art houses such as Luma or LAS or the Serpentines galleries, and they offer you specific venues. And I'm very much interested in this kind of work process, how you find a perfect fit for your art pieces in these very different and most of the time very monumental spaces.
Yeah, I think there are three things, and maybe I forget two as I start speaking about the first. But the first one is that when I make the work, it's a place. Right. So when I work out in the environment, I'm working on a computer. I'm building a place. I'm not starting by making the work thinking about a screen or a space or something. I literally just start building the environment out in 3D. There's up, there's down, and then I start working with time. Things can transform over time. An insect, a lamp, a sound can kind of connect to each other. And I built this out for a while without really thinking about this space too much. But then I reached a point where I started thinking about how can I overlay this virtual space on top of the physical one, so people can kind of enter that work. And one really important thing there is sound in my work, because we have like a three-dimensional sound system that I've connected to these video game engines. So if you see something on a screen like this bird, if it flies in the virtual world from over there to here, you'll hear it move through the architecture. So I play a lot with like screens in virtual worlds, almost like windows in cathedrals. But like if you enter a cathedral, it's an instrument. Like cathedrals were built to amplify the chorus. And the glass windows on the sides give you an idea to where you are in like the story of that space. But there's nothing really in this space. So you have this huge invisible mass, and museums have huge invisible masses. So I just kind of found, for me, like an interesting space. How do you occupy this invisible mass and create these windows into other worlds, but make you feel like you're in that world and also outside of it? But literally, I then start designing the virtual world with the architecture in mind later in the process, and the sound. So there's like a size of the virtual, like maybe here there's like 4 floors, like in the stairs. Maybe each of those is a floor in this desert lake, one below, one in the middle, one is the skies or something. And then I'd kind of like layer them on top of each other and have the sound on each floor, and then have them also kind of interconnect, so that physically you're walking through these 4 different parts of this environment. So I really always like adapt the virtual world on top of the architecture, which is because this is a 3-dimensional space, and a virtual world is a 3-dimensional space, and the sound is 3-dimensional, so you can sort of put them on top of each other. So we have, every exhibition we do, we have a 3D model of the architecture that I kind of put on top of here, and then it tracks what goes on in sound and things. It's very technical, but it allows me, my studio, to sort of make these strange experiences where you feel like you're in the building, but you're also in that world, and you can kind of go back and forth a bit. And the other reason is also that I've just really since I was a kid, been very fascinated by the craft of making virtual worlds. And that's kind of I've sort of just been fascinated by that, and still am. The craft of making like virtual landscapes and places and the feelings that they have has always been very fascinating to me. So I also like showing in museums because I can introduce that type of world and craft to an audience that might not ever have entered them in video games. You know, but at the same time, I also want to show people that like video games that you can also use those tools without making these big commercial games. They're just artistic tools. I mean,
Of course.
it's just a 3-dimensional coordinate system that you can interact with. That's all it is. So it's also, those two are also important to me. You know, so that's why I show work in very different contexts, from museums to like film festivals, and really underground gaming spaces sometimes, music. Yeah, there's kind of different places you can show your work, and I like that fluidity. I like that. I like to design the work in a place where it's not quite what you'd expect from a game, and it's not quite what you'd expect from a music installation, or not quite from a traditional art show or something. It's something a little bit different, slightly off tangent, sort of. And I do that intentionally. You know, I think about that when I make the work for physical spaces. I mean, I think that's interesting. Or I mean, I think it's amazing when there's like a kid walking in and they suddenly feel connected to it because this world they know that their parents don't or something from a game suddenly feel is now shown. And at the same time, when you have people coming in and they had never experienced that kind of environmental storytelling that you can do in games, because games are really the best medium, I think, to tell stories about place, because you build a place, but it's kind of a conceptual place, so you can break physical barriers and boundaries that you otherwise cannot, right? So you can talk about quite abstract concepts and make them interactive or sensory to people. So it's a combination of those. Yeah.
You work quite closely with the Natural History Museum in Berlin for your project Berber that was shown at Berghain. Shortly after COVID. And I was wondering what this collaboration process was like. How did you approach the scientists? Was there any exchange process? Was it the other side, like the scientists could benefit from?
Yes. So this is a project called Berber I did in Berlin. It was a big exhibition for 3 months, and I created it with the Natural History Museum in different kind of time scales. So some people told me about species that used to live in Berlin thousands of years ago, and then they show me the specimens, and I take photos, and I digitize them. So this is like life that no longer lives, but that used to live beneath the city of Berlin. Then at the same time, they're doing active studies of the rivers in Berlin and around Berlin. So I went out with 2 biologists that are currently working in the Natural History Museum, and they then show me, salamanders and species right now, and then I photograph those. So now I have material from the past, from the museum, and I have something they're looking at right now. And then I also have myself, I spent a few months in a canoe with a collaborator, Matt McCorkle, and we recorded like sounds from the water of the present. So I have material from literal, actual, this is actual.
It's there.
Yeah, that was there, and that is there now. And you can then you literally connect them together. And with the Natural History Museum in Berlin, this started because they're part of this massive European project of spearheading how to make data more accessible. Because this museum has billions of insect specimens. And there's all these studies of insects and birds in all of Europe. But you have like many thousands of times more data than you have the data being used. Like, it's crazy how much knowledge there is. Because natural history museums have, in their form, has more or less existed like for 400 years. So it's 400 years of just collecting. Collecting, data, collecting. But like no real question of how can people access it? What stories can you tell from this? So they have this entire program of rethinking how different groups can have access to it. So I was an artist making that, but there was also like citizen science projects, there were school projects, there was like many different groups, and I did the art project within that. So I worked directly with their director, Johannes Vogel, on thinking about my project, and I was diving into that. Berlin, the first 4 letters, B-E-R-L, is an old Slavic word that means swamp. And people spoke Slavic in that region 1,000 years ago, and Berlin was founded for a trade route that went from Eastern Europe up through northern Germany and up to Scandinavia. So Berlin originated as a bridge to cross a swamp, and that's why it has the name Berl, like B-E-R-L. So I worked with the Natural History Museum to kind of map this and create an artwork for the city in a way. And then at the same time, I worked with a linguist, Sabine Asmus, and she showed me songs that people used to sing in this place hundreds of years ago, and the songs were ways of telling stories about the place. So they were the songs were maps of this place. So I had also like a linguistic history connection to the place, and then I morphed these together, just like the lake. Then I start putting all this together to a story, to a world, to an instrument that is exhibited. Yeah.
And how did the scientists or your collaborators in Berlin reacted to your pieces? I think that's also very
quite
interesting.
well. I mean, it was really interesting. I worked directly with the active researchers studying this right now, these 2 biologists, and they loved going out with me mapping these places. It was really they were so passionate about it because they were like, no one ever comes and look at our stuff. No one ever asks us all these questions. It's like one of them, he could find all these salamanders. And then he showed me like, the belly of the salamander is like orange and yellow. And then he starts showing me and emailing me his photos of these bellies of salamanders. Like he's so passionate about this material. So then that salamander belly has to become like, as part of the artwork on this giant screen. It's like a salamander belly. you know, and he's so excited to see this salamander Bailey on the screen. So there's this passion to it that I really find inspiring. But we also created an educational program with the museum, because they had never had an educational program about the swamps and wetlands beneath Berlin. So it's like, as I was doing research for the artwork, they built out an educational program and research. I was actively out with some of the biologists doing this, and it ended up being one of the most popular programs, so now it's a permanent educational program at the museum. And we also ended, or they ended, in extension of the exhibition, we ended up having like a little area at the Natural History Museum. Not in my exhibition was in a whole other space, but at the actual Natural History Museum, they ended up being like a little corner about the wetlands and the work and project. And there people could book tours in canoes.
Oh, wow.
And they had hundreds of tours organized to the wetlands around Berlin. And people could book them at the museum and at my exhibition. So some people went to my exhibition, and like some person literally emailed me like, I've never been in a canoe, but your project inspired me to go in a canoe. It was amazing. And then people in the museum then go into the artwork and they're like, this is kind of strange, but it makes me feel like what it's like being in that environment. So there was this duality. I mean, this was a massive, this project took 2 years to make. This is like a big undertaking. But I like these ways of working with experts where I don't try to do a lesser of many. So by working with the Natural History Museum, I was like, so we do this together and you build the education program. And because they build the education program, my artwork doesn't need to over-explain itself. So I can make it much more powerful as a more conceptual sensory experience. Because I know there's also this other place with the story, and people can go to both places. So typically when I work with scientists or other artists, I always try to find ways that they can like unfold something in a new way, where it's a stronger element than something, you know, I could direct or something. It's sort of, I like looking at it as like putting many pillars next to each other with different experts, rather than trying to like fuse them all together, where it's like a less interesting artwork, less interesting science, so where everybody has to compromise. I think it's more interesting finding ways where each expertise kind of like has a spike in a way in the project, where they kind of get to unfold fully. But it might also mean that some people only see the artwork and they have no idea that we also had canoe trips. So some people do the canoe trips and they have no idea that's an artwork. But from my perspective, that doesn't really matter, because all of this just helps creating some kind of awareness and a connection to these wetlands and rivers in Berlin. So for me, I'm like, I don't really feel like the artwork needs to push there's a lot of research in the project, but I don't feel like that explicit narrative has to be so strong in the artwork. I think the artwork is actually much stronger when it dives in and it dares to be much more like sensory or something. But that's a project that is like my favorite project.
Mine as well, I have to say.
And a big reason is that, you know, it's very satisfying knowing that you have these connections, but it requires a lot of trust.
Of course.
So it's because the director of the Natural History Museum directly wants to innovate what some of their scientists are working on or what they can do. If he had not done that, and if I had encountered a lot of blocks in how I could work with the scientists, it wouldn't have turned out like that, you know. So it requires, and I love just diving into stuff like that, but it requires a mutual trust and curiosity. If that is not there, then it's too difficult.
What you showed during our conversation is the productivity of these kind of collaborations between artists and scientists. And I personally also truly believe in the potential of these kind of collaborations, not only as a driver for innovation, but also for awareness, for pressing topics that relate to our times. I think it's very necessary to develop different kind of strategies to reach out to audiences and to talk about these very complex topics you are dealing with. So I'm wondering, now we have about 50 minutes of conversation, if there are any questions in the audience. Please feel warmly welcome to ask your questions to Jakob.
Or you.
Or me, yes. Yes, of course. I think we have audience microphones.
Question, yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
I think. It's okay, then we jump over to you.
Well, I was thinking about what you said about the psychology side. It means how we react in our mind. Because when you spoke about the ephemeral lake, we live in a very vulnerable place, which are the Alps. And for instance, probably many of the people in the audience know that last year we had a kind of ephemeral something that happened in the mountains, that some glacier fall down in a lake, and we had some iceberg for a while. So it happens in the Garen Pass. So many people went to see this fabulous landscape that now has disappeared. What we experience, for instance, going to the mountain, is a profound feeling of loss and sadness. And personally, when you said also that in your artwork you have the choice to feel or to get out of what is very anxious to be in, that's exactly what we experience also when we see the loss of the landscape. It's a profound sense of sadness, but also anxiety. So I think it's very important that you work on this area in which we can see some other channel of the body experience. Otherwise, the climate change is only something that we think about, but we don't feel in the body. And I think this is very important. Also, when you are so scared, because you hear the sounds of the mountains going down, this is very, it's anguish. So it's not really a question that I have. Right. I was just sharing some kind of experience that probably other people also had. So I just want to thank you for this contribution that you're giving.
No, that's
to reflect on this.
I mean, that's it's very nice and a very sad and a very real comment. But this artwork here, actually, we didn't talk about it, but it's an artwork called Tongs of Valais. So I went to the Arolla Glacier in 2022, and there was this big glacial cave that was like 230 meters long. And I went early 2022, and I digitized it. So also, I didn't talk about this because I don't know how complex I would go, but when I make my work, I take thousands of photographies, and then thousands of those turn into a 3D model. So it's kind of documentary approach in a way. But I digitized this glacial cave, and then 10 months later, it collapsed. So this place is no longer there. So then I went there again, and I talked to a biologist she's 84, and she studied this place in the 60s. So I interviewed her on her personal memory of the first time she went to this glacier. And then I created an artwork, a video and sound piece where you journey through this glacial cave, which doesn't exist anymore. Just 2 years ago it was there, and now it's not there. And then you have her memory. But the thing that I felt like gave it like another emotional resonance is that she also described the mountains as like organs, as living things. And the glacial cave looks like a thorax. When you zoom out, it looks like looking into your throat. They call it glacial tongue, the natural phenomena. So I then also made this kind of music, which is a little bit like a sad choir that sings to the echo of this virtual cave. And then you have her memories. I made a work about that a couple of years ago, but I don't, like, as an artist, I also don't have any answers. I am more like, sometimes people have these experiences, but then when people tell me things like this, I feel like, there's some kind of purpose to it. You know, I think it kind of makes you want to keep making things, knowing that some people feel like this. And actually, one thing I want to do next, that I'm trying to do, is actually to go back into video games and make a game on mental health and climate. So I'm working with this researcher in Stanford, doing the preliminary research, because they're finding that in like teenagers today, there's massive climate anxiety. Mm-hmm. And there's something about technology, environment, mental health, that I have a hunch that's something to make, you know, or just give people the room to feel some of these things is important. So the kind of ritual experiences some of the works. But yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you.
There was another question up front here. Yeah, yeah. You don't want to ask a question? Well, yes.
Grazie, buonasera. Queste immagini sono molto interessanti. E sembra quasi sulla Luna o da qualche parte del mondo. E mi è incuriosito i colori che lei... Penso che li ha fatti lei questi colori, che non sono naturali. E l'altra curiosità è che in mezzo a questo paesaggio così, non so come descriverlo, e c'è l'altro ambiente molto bello, molto colto, molto raffinato. Come mai ha messo questa, diciamo così, vicinanza di questi due ambienti? Grazie.
Yeah. So the colors, they are actually real and modified at the same time. So I'm thinking how I can explain it. The lighting comes from a kind of a spherical photograph of a specific time of day. So there's like a way you can photograph information about light. But of course a photograph is always also modified. And also the screen changes the color a bit here. But they found the basic light is from a specific actual time of day. But then I have many different times a day. A morning, a summer, an evening, a night, dawn, dusk, a dust storm, like in this desert in California, or rain. And each of these have different lighting. So I have like 8 different ways of having the color of the lighting inside of the environment. And then sometimes it's just like the lighting of the actual photograph, but they change into each other. So sometimes you have a transformation happening between 2 different actual lights, and it creates these kind of strange transformation that makes it feel more like imaginative. Mm-hmm. But it's 2 photographs kind of morphing together. Yeah, so that's how the lighting is done, and then it simulates the different formations. But there's one thing in some of the works too, where like the one you say that looks like the moon, that specific image is an actual these like little rocks in the desert. It's probably just that we're not used to looking at them, so we have forgotten that things right here can look like the moon. We just don't look at them. So this is something that I find as an artist quite interesting to work with, and this is why I spent so long in a place, because I try to find the things that has that feeling to it. But if you have to photograph something that you don't know exists, you cannot plan it. So, but that is why you get these strange feelings sometimes in the work, perhaps, like the moon. And then I have the same feeling when I look at the work. I'm like, oh, this feels like the moon or Mars. But actually, it's just a rock in the desert. It's just not a rock people look at. So it's more like bringing that back. So I try in my work to, like when people are in the exhibition, sometimes it's quite visceral, like plays with your mind. But I think that's just because we don't really look so much at these places anymore. So we kind of forget the range of the way life can look in the actual world. And then I kind of focus on these. Out of thousands of photographs, the 10 I use or something, the 3D models, are those that has that feeling to it. They're unfamiliar, but it's real. It's just very small and, yeah. Yeah. I hope that answered it. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for...
sorry.
Sorry, was another question?
There was a next question? Or we can come back to you. So yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was saying thank you very much for the very insightful conversation. And lately I became very interested in the coded objects. So I was very interested in this idea of like codification process of coding, encoding. And I was wondering how this codification, which is always linked to a kind of norm and normativity, how can codification preserve like creativity and so the plurality of diversity, how these two things can go together, and if you see a contrast or otherwise you see like something that makes you moving forward.
Yeah, this is kind of part of questions I ask myself like every day in the process, but there are specific things that I actually try to do. So one of them is this thing with some of the rocks. I try to code rocks that hasn't been coded before, and I put them together and show them from a perspective of something that people haven't seen. So then there's like in that archive of data or something, now there's a new thing that feels and looks different. Or when I work with natural history archives, which are also massive databases, basically, of knowledge of environments, I try to put the things in the artwork that someone tells me about more emotionally and not scientifically. Like in this work, Balbal, there's a blue beetle. There's not a picture over here, but there's a very iconic blue beetle in the artwork. But that blue beetle is in the artwork. It's like a 3D scanned beetle. After like 2 months of talking to the scientist back and forth and trying to find something. And then, one day he sends me this beetle where he's just sort of like, I really like this specimen. And then I'm like, why? It's just kind of funny. It has interesting blue color. And then again, he says like, but it's not really from exactly the region you're working in. But then I'm like, doesn't matter. We put it in there because it triggers that emotional response. So then there's like an emotional response to an archive and a code. Then there's to environment, digitizing things that are kind of outside of what you typically look at. So outside your vision, something emotional. So I try to do different choices that embraces a response or creativity or something. But because you're dealing with code, you have to make hard-coded choices. So you have to kind of sometimes reach points where you change your method or something, or your setup, where you go, what you code, or the technology you use, to achieve that difference. Because otherwise, very quickly, it all starts to look and feel the same, all of it, very, very quickly, and more fast, because the tools are becoming more and more kind of standardized. So faster and faster, everything becomes the same. So, but equally, I then think it's more and more important to just kind of use it a little bit funky. But however someone wants to do that, there's no rule for how to do that. If I made a rule for that, it would defy the purpose. I would just do the same again as the big tech companies, which tell you how to use the tool. But you can set down different processes or something for how you're going to try to find something different, right? So, and yeah, I mean, that's the thing when you deal with technology, and especially actual code. It is pretty like uncompromising if things don't work, if it breaks and so on. It's just like, it won't. It will, nothing will happen. So you have to make these very intentional choices sometimes. Mm-hmm. But try to explore something before you make that choice that challenges yourself, it does something different. You know, and the artists, I mean, there's so many artists using these technologies now, it's amazing. Everybody does do it in so many different ways, you know, with performance or voice or glitches even. Some people just try to destroy technology and from that make artworks, you know. But for me, it's just I've been doing it for so long, I'm kind of like, that's a little bit boring for me as a creator. I want to use the tool to make something new. But yeah.
I think we have to end our conversation at this point, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude for you, Jakob, being here with us and giving these kind of insights in your artistic practices. And I also would like to thank, of course, again, the IBSA Foundation and also the MASI for having us here, for giving us the opportunity being here together on stage. The good thing is, even though we have to end here, there is the opportunity to meet, I think, right here, to toast and to come in conversation with Jakob. So, I would like to encourage all of you here in the audience to join us, and let's talk to each other. Thanks for being here tonight with us.
Thank you. Thank you.